In 1213 BCE, the high priests of Egypt performed a final, sacred act upon the body of the pharaoh, Ramesses II. They carefully tucked small, dried black berries into the nostrils of the king. These were not local offerings or desert herbs. They were imported, precious peppercorns from the distant Malabar coast of India. The most powerful man in the ancient world took the taste of a global empire into the afterlife. This humble spice was already a catalyst for a world-spanning trade network that would eventually topple kingdoms. The peppercorn sitting in your kitchen shaker today is not a seasoning. It is a remnant of a violent, multi-millennial struggle for global dominance. How did a tiny, dried fruit dictate the movement of navies and the fall of empires? The answer lies in a hunger that reshaped the map of the world. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was obsessed with the luxury of the East. Pliny the Elder recorded the staggering cost of this addiction in his chronicles. He noted that the Roman economy hemorrhaged 50 million sesterces every single year to pay for spice. Gold flowed out of Rome and into the hands of merchants on the Indian subcontinent. The empire grew wealthy, but it also grew dangerously dependent on a supply chain it could not control. This decision to rely on foreign spice seemed small at the time. It was not. The trade routes stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and desert. Pepper moved from the humid forests of Kerala to the ports of the Red Sea. From there, it traveled by camel caravan across the blistering sands of the Arabian Peninsula. It reached the Mediterranean, where it was bought by intermediaries in Alexandria or Antioch. The price of the spice inflated with every hand it passed through. By the time it reached a Roman market, the cost was astronomical. Pepper became a form of currency in its own right during the Middle Ages. Landlords demanded it as rent from their tenant farmers. Nobles used it as a dowry for their daughters. It functioned as collateral for loans in the banking houses of Venice and Genoa. These city-states built their entire influence on the monopoly of the spice trade. They controlled the flow, they set the price, and they guarded the routes with their lives. European powers grew desperate to bypass these middlemen. The search for a direct route to the Malabar coast became the primary driver of maritime exploration. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama achieved the impossible. He successfully navigated around the Cape of Good Hope and reached the port of Calicut, India. He arrived with the intent to claim the spice source for the Portuguese crown. He met the Zamarin of Calicut, the Hindu ruler who controlled the local trade. The negotiations stalled immediately. Da Gama lacked the high-value trade goods expected by the sophisticated Indian markets. He demanded exclusive rights to the pepper supply. The Zamarin refused to break his existing trade agreements with Arab merchants. This moment in 1498 was the point of no return. The existing complex trade networks of the Indian Ocean were about to collide with European military aggression. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The peaceful exchange of goods was about to be replaced by the iron of the cannon. Vasco da Gama returned to the Malabar coast in 1502 with a fleet of 20 warships. He did not come to negotiate. He anchored his ships off the coast of Calicut and leveled his guns at the city. He intercepted a fleet of merchant vessels carrying cargo and civilians across the Arabian Sea. The Portuguese forces seized the ships and their crews. Da Gama ordered his men to mutilate the sailors and the passengers aboard the captured vessels. The screams of over 800 people echoed across the water. He forced the trade concessions at the edge of a sword. The era of the spice trade as a voluntary exchange had ended. The era of colonial maritime violence had begun. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived shortly after to solidify the Portuguese grip on the region. He understood that to control the pepper, one had to control the geography of the sea. He seized the port of Goa in 1510, turning it into the capital of Portuguese India. He captured Malacca in 1511, securing the choke point between the Indian Ocean and the spice markets of the East. The spice trade was now a strategic military asset. It was no longer just about seasoning food. It was about the calculated, brutal suppression of global competition. By the start of the 17th century, the Dutch and the British saw the wealth flowing into Portugal. They formed the East India Company and the Dutch VOC to challenge the Portuguese hegemony. The Dutch utilized superior naval technology to enforce their own monopolies. They targeted the Indonesian archipelago, where pepper production was concentrated. When producers refused to sell exclusively to the Dutch, the VOC responded with total destruction. They burned entire crops of pepper plants to keep supply low and prices artificially high. The scorched earth left local farmers in famine and ruin. This pursuit of pepper drove the creation of the modern corporation. The need to fund these massive, high-risk naval expeditions forced the creation of joint stock companies. Investors pooled their capital to share the risk of shipwrecks, piracy, and war. They also invented maritime insurance to protect their financial interests. The modern global economy was built on the back of the pepper trade. It was a system designed to maximize profit through state-sponsored violence. The pepper you use today is the product of this long, dark history. The spice, once used to honor a dead pharaoh, became the fuel for a global engine of exploitation. The supply chains that once required massacres to maintain are now invisible, quiet, and mundane. The reality of that history remains buried beneath the convenience of the modern store shelf. Archaeologists carefully removed the resin plugs from the nose of Ramses II in 1976. They found small black peppercorns tucked deep inside the royal nostrils. The spice originated thousands of miles away in the humid forests of Kerala. This mummification ritual required a commodity more precious than gold to the Egyptians. It signaled the king's status to the gods in the afterlife. Pliny the Elder observed the drain of Roman wealth centuries later. He recorded that 50 million sesterces flowed out of Rome every single year. This massive capital vanished into the hands of merchants on the Malabar coast. The Roman economy buckled under the weight of this insatiable demand. Gold coins disappeared from the imperial treasury to pay for sacks of dried berries. This decision to build a global trade network seemed small at the time. It was not. The logistics of moving pepper required a chain of thousands of human hands. Farmers harvested the green spikes from climbing vines in the Indian heat. They dried the berries in the sun until the skin turned black and wrinkled. Caravans hauled the heavy sacks across the scorching Arabian Peninsula by camel. Merchants waited in the ports of Alexandria to collect the precious cargo. The price of the spice inflated with every hand it passed through. By the time it reached a Roman market, the cost was astronomical. Pepper became a form of currency in its own right during the Middle Ages. Landlords demanded it as rent from their tenant farmers. Nobles used it as a dowry for their daughters. It functioned as collateral for loans in the banking houses of Venice and Genoa. These city-states built their entire influence on the monopoly of the spice trade. They controlled the flow, they set the price, and they guarded the routes with their lives. European powers grew desperate to bypass these middlemen. The search for a direct route to the Malabar coast became the primary driver of maritime exploration. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama achieved the impossible. He successfully navigated around the Cape of Good Hope and reached the port of Calicut, India. He arrived with the intent to claim the spice source for the Portuguese crown. He met the Zamorin of Calicut, the Hindu ruler who controlled the local trade. The negotiations stalled immediately. Da Gama lacked the high-value trade goods expected by the sophisticated Indian markets. He demanded exclusive rights to the pepper supply. The Zamorin refused to break his existing trade agreements with Arab merchants. This moment in 1498 was the point of no return. The existing, complex trade networks of the Indian Ocean were about to collide with European military aggression. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The peaceful exchange of goods was about to be replaced by the iron of the cannon. Portuguese ships anchored in the shallow waters off the coast of Calicut. The wooden hulls groaned against the heavy swells of the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama watched the shoreline through a brass telescope. Armed sailors lined the decks with their arquebuses primed. The Zamorin sent a delegation of officials to board the flagship. They wore fine silks and carried palm leaf scrolls of official correspondence. These men represented a sophisticated bureaucracy that managed global trade routes. They expected a diplomatic envoy seeking a fair commercial exchange. Instead, they encountered a desperate commander with a hold full of worthless trinkets. The Portuguese offered woolen cloth and hats as payment for high-grade spice. The Indian officials laughed at the crude, heavy gifts. They demanded gold, silver, and high-quality coral in return for the peppercorns. The negotiation collapsed into a tense standoff of clashing expectations. The Portuguese realized their trade goods held no value in this market. They turned to the only language they mastered with efficiency. The heavy iron cannons were rolled into position at the gun ports. Gunpowder smoke billowed across the calm surface of the harbor. The Portuguese opened fire on the coastal infrastructure of Calicut. Stone warehouses crumbled under the force of the iron cannonballs. The local trade fleet burned as the fire spread through the rigging. The Zamorin ordered his archers to return fire from the shore. Wooden arrows whistled through the humid air toward the European ships. The Portuguese retreated to their vessels to regroup and plot their return. This violence marked the beginning of a new era of maritime warfare. The era of peaceful merchant cooperation ended in a single afternoon. The Portuguese returned years later with a massive fleet of heavily armed carracks. They blockaded the Malabar coast to force the local rulers into submission. They demanded the exclusive right to purchase the entire annual harvest of pepper. The local merchants resisted by diverting their supply to underground channels. The Portuguese responded by burning every vessel that did not carry their permit. They patrolled the coastline with squadrons of warships. They turned the Indian Ocean into a private lake for the Portuguese crown. The flow of pepper shifted from the traditional overland routes to the sea. The Venetian merchants in Italy watched their warehouses stand empty. Their political influence waned as their monopoly on the spice trade vanished. The Dutch arrived in the region a century later to claim the prize. They brought more ships and larger cannons to the conflict. The Dutch East India Company established a fortified base at Batavia. They built stone bastions to protect their stockpiles of black gold. They signed treaties with local sultans at the point of a musket. The VOC enforced these agreements with brutal military precision. They destroyed entire groves of pepper vines to keep local supply low. They punished farmers who sold their harvests to independent traders. The price of pepper remained high in Europe through artificial scarcity. The Dutch investors grew rich on the profit margins of this monopoly. The cost of this system was paid in the blood of the local laborers. Entire villages were displaced to clear land for intensive pepper cultivation. The soil was exhausted by the relentless demand for higher yields. The ecology of the archipelago changed as the monoculture expanded. The spice, once used to honor dead kings, became a tool of mass exploitation. The global economy shifted its axis toward the control of these supply chains. Banks in Amsterdam and London grew on the capital generated by the trade. The modern corporate structure emerged from these high-risk naval ventures. Shareholders demanded dividends that required the constant expansion of the market. The pepper trade proved that a single commodity could reshape world politics. The spice that once sat in the nostrils of a pharaoh now fueled empires. The logistical challenge of moving the berry required a massive, hidden workforce. Farmers in the humid heat of Kerala harvested the green spikes. They dried the berries on wooden mats in the intense tropical sun. The skin shriveled and turned the characteristic black color of commerce. Sacks of the spice were hauled to the docks by teams of oxen. Ships carried the cargo across the vast, dangerous expanse of the ocean. Insurance agents calculated the risk of shipwrecks and pirate raids. The price increased with every port of call on the long journey. The spice arrived in the markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. It sat in small, decorated jars on the tables of the wealthy. The history of the violence that brought it there remained entirely invisible. The consumer saw only the flavor, never the scorched earth of the colony. The trade routes established by the Portuguese and Dutch endured for centuries. The mechanisms of the monopoly became the blueprint for global shipping. The demand for pepper never ceased, even as the empires collapsed. The spice remains a staple in every kitchen on the planet today. The mundane nature of the object obscures the scale of its impact. The history of the world was written in the scent of dried pepper. The cost of that history is still etched into the geography of the East. The ruins of the old trading ports stand as silent monuments to the trade. The sea continues to wash over the sites of ancient, forgotten battles. The pepper sits in the cabinet, waiting for the next meal. It is a small, hard berry with a story of global domination. The cycle of consumption continues as it has for thousands of years. The true price of the spice is rarely paid at the checkout counter. Vasco da Gama returned to the Malabar coast in 1502. His fleet carried 20 heavy carracks armed with bronze cannons. The Zamorin of Calicut refused to grant the Portuguese exclusive trade rights. Da Gama responded by blockading the harbor and cutting off all merchant traffic. He intercepted a fleet of Arab vessels sailing from Calicut. The Portuguese sailors looted the ships and seized the cargo of spices. Gama ordered the prisoners, numbering over 800 people, to be held on the decks. The crews systematically mutilated the sailors and civilians in full view of the shore. The horrific display served as a message of absolute maritime dominance. The Zamorin watched from the coast as his port city burned under cannon fire. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in India shortly after to solidify this control. He recognized that the spice trade relied on specific geographical choke points. Albuquerque seized the city of Goa in 1510 to serve as a permanent base. He captured the port of Malacca in 1511 to control the flow of goods toward China. The Portuguese enforced a system of mandatory permits for all merchant ships. Any vessel traveling without a Portuguese pass faced immediate seizure or destruction. The Indian Ocean was no longer a space for free trade. It became a private waterway for the Portuguese crown. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The Dutch arrived in the region at the dawn of the 17th century. They brought more capital and more ships than the Portuguese could match. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, known as the VOC, formed in 1602. It was the world's first formal joint stock company. The Dutch investors demanded consistent dividends from their spice shipments. The VOC established a fortified headquarters at Batavia on the island of Java. They used superior naval artillery to dismantle the remaining Portuguese influence. The Dutch enforced monopolies through the systematic destruction of nature itself. They burned entire groves of pepper vines that grew outside their control. This scorched earth policy prevented local farmers from selling to independent traders. Artificial scarcity kept the price of black gold at record highs in Europe. The reality was far darker. The soil of the archipelago was exhausted by the relentless demand for monoculture. Villages were cleared of their inhabitants to make room for intensive pepper production. The local labor force was coerced into a system of total economic dependency. The wealth of Amsterdam was built on these distant, burning fields. Banks emerged to manage the massive capital flowing from the spice trade. Insurance agents developed complex models to account for the risk of naval warfare. The global financial infrastructure was forged in the heat of these monopolies. The British East India Company eventually shifted its focus toward the Indian mainland. They transitioned from simple trading agents to colonial administrators of the region. The spice trade funded the expansion of the British Empire for 2 centuries. The pepper that once sat in the nostrils of a pharaoh now fueled global industry. Logistical networks established for the berry became the blueprint for modern shipping. The mundane nature of the object obscures the scale of its impact. The history of the world was written in the scent of dried pepper. The ruins of the old trading ports stand as silent monuments to the trade. The sea continues to wash over the sites of ancient, forgotten battles. The pepper sits in your cabinet, waiting for the next meal. You reach for the grinder, unaware that the contents were once the cause of massacres and the birth of modern corporate greed. That small black berry in your hand is a relic of a violent history that never truly ended. You are simply the latest person to consume the spoils of an empire that still shapes your world today.